Ah yes, the Commodore 64, one of the most prolific home computers of all time. Though taking into consideration both the lower price point and the higher capabilities, there is no question as to why this machine dominated the home computer scene of the early 1980s. However, following close behind was Atari, who produced their own line of successful 8-bit home computers. Commodore and Atari were at constant war with each other, and it's quite comparable to the rivalry between Nintendo and Sega that would come several years later. So with this conflict, successors to each company's computers would be inevitable. However, this did not go as planned. Both Atari and Commodore faced some internal issues, and Jack Tramiel of Commodore left his company, bought Atari, replaced Atari's staff, started working on Atari's successor, the Atari ST. Meanwhile, Jay Miner from Atari and his team developed their own computer, codenamed DeLorean. And since Atari didn't accept it, they were worried that the computer wouldn't make it. However, after Tramiel left, Commodore bought Jay Miner's team. Their computer would be released in 1985. This was the birth of the Amiga, a very impressive machine that is considered by many to be the first true multimedia multitasking home computer.
Here's one of our classic demos called the bouncing ball.
It's really impressive.
Now, Rick, this is an impressive demo, but I want you to tell me why it's impressive. What are we seeing that the computer can do?
Well, what you're seeing is synchronized moving graphics, color graphics with the sound all at the same time. And in addition to this, we still have down here below an application running.
So you're running a word processor while you're carrying on this sound graphics demo.
Yep, and I can correct my typos.
Though despite the system's capabilities and impressive nature, it was rather expensive, so development began on a cost-reduced version. This would result in the Amiga 500, which was released in 1987. This was the most popular model, and the one most people remember. Later, there was the 500 Plus, which ran on a new chipset and operating system. Later, there was the Amiga 600, which was basically a smaller version of the 500 Plus and is far more common in the former. There was also the CD-TV, which was a failed attempt to get into the console market. The machine itself and the software for it are rare as hell. Then there was the Amiga 1200, which was an advanced 32-bit machine, and there was also the CD32 console, which was basically a console version of the 1200. It was more successful than the CD-TV, but it failed as well, and it's rather rare. I have an Amiga 500, which I got on eBay with everything you see here for around $80 US. But the shipping was just as much, leaving a grand total of a little over $160. As one could tell, this was not an ordinary purchase of mine. In fact, it was actually my only Christmas present, and my joy could not be described with words. Another thing I should add is that if you want an Amiga, you'll probably want to get a PAL machine like I did, as NTSC models aren't as compatible with the software. This is a shame because the Amiga has one of the best libraries of software I've ever seen. Hell, I think it actually does have the best library I've ever seen. While most gaming machines focus on trying to bring the arcade experience home, the Amiga not only accomplished that, it excelled at it, and in my personal opinion, it did that better than anything else. And I'll talk about some of the games specifically later, because there are some other things I want to get out of the way. Anyway, the Amiga runs on a Motorola 68000 CPU running at 7.16 MHz for NTSC machines and 7.09 MHz for PAL machines. It had 512 kilobytes of RAM, but was commonly upgraded to a full megabyte, and I heard that it could be expanded even further if one wanted to. As far as sound goes, it was capable of 4 channels of 28 kHz 8-bit samples. Now some of you are probably thinking, oh, 8-bit samples? That must mean it sounds like an NES. You would be incredibly mistaken, as the NES had PSG sound, which consisted of 2 square waves, 1 triangle wave, and 1 white noise. For those of you who didn't understand a single word that I said, this is NES music. And this is Amiga music. Not to mention, composer Chris Hulsbeck created his own sound format, TFMX, which was capable of 7 channels instead of the standard 4. Saying that's impressive is an incredible understatement. This is only scratching the surface. For the 80s, cutting edge doesn't even describe it. It was way, way ahead of its time, and it beat pretty much everything in its path. The software came on nice blue 3.5-inch floppy disks, which was a very common format at the time. However, Amiga formatted floppy disks held 880 kilobytes of space, which was more than what the other competing formatted disks can handle at the time. Games were also repackaged a lot by varying distributors like Kix, and these repackaged copies are often easier to get a hold of, but there are exceptions, like the elusive North American copy of Turrican from Enterprise. Much like other home computer games of the time period, these games came in cardboard boxes that often had some pretty neat stuff in them along with the game. Extra stuff that developers these days don't really think to put in, depending on the game of course. Hell, even the instruction manuals are pretty elaborate. Like Battlehawk's 1942, for example, the instruction manual has a lot of historical overview and elaborate descriptions that Infinity Ward wouldn't ever begin to comprehend. As one could see, the computer has a really cool all-in-one design that was commonplace back in the day, but you don't really see anymore these days. On the back here we have 2 DB9 joystick ports, composite video output, a disk drive port, a serial port, a parallel port, an AC adapter port, RGB video output, and a composite monochrome video port. If you don't have an Amiga monitor and you want color video on your TV, then you get the Amiga 520 modulator, which sellers on eBay commonly package with the computer. But then there are region problems. It will still display monochrome video on NTSC TVs unless you get a converter like this one. It works alright with most games, but the color is kind of oversaturated. The one thing I find slightly annoying with the setup is how the power switch isn't on the computer but the AC adapter. But thankfully, my power outlet is close enough for me to have the back end of the brick facing me so I can turn the machine on and off without too much trouble. The Amiga runs on an operating system called Workbench, and quite frankly, I just love it. Just playing around with some of the applications is always fun, and it really had everything you could possibly want back in the day. The keyboard functions very well when kept in good condition. Unfortunately, my escape button and left shift buttons don't really work, and the spacebar isn't quite as responsive as it could be, but it is an old used computer, so I can't complain about it too much. But thankfully, it appears to be more durable than most modern keyboards I've seen. The mouse actually has a pretty neat design, and it works well. Otherwise, there isn't much to say about it. The joysticks, on the other hand, vary, but they usually look something like this. This is the Spectra Video. A common feature on these joysticks is an auto-fire feature, which is very comparable to a turbo button, except you don't have to press anything. However, I have some issues with this joystick in particular. First being that some games make use of a second fire button. Now this joystick makes you think that you have 2 different fire buttons, but nope! Both of these buttons do the exact same thing, so it ends up like having a NES controller with 2 A buttons. My bigger problem with this joystick is the pitiful range. It isn't that much of an issue with spaceship shooters, simulators, and driving games like Lotus Turbo Challenge, but with platformers like Turrican 2, it's a nightmare. Since most platformers on Amiga have up to jump, which normally isn't a problem, it only makes an already awkward controller feel more awkward. Thankfully, you could just plug in a Sega Genesis controller and the games play a lot better. Unlike the home consoles of the day, pretty much anyone could make a game for the Amiga. The tools and software to make these games really aren't too hard to get a hold of. Hell, even I have programming software, but unfortunately it didn't come with a manual, so I don't have any knowledge of the language to use and build off of over time, which is disappointing since it looks like it really isn't that hard to use. Well, anyway, a lot of developers really got started on the Amiga, and you might even recognize a few of them. Teams like the Bitmap Brothers, Team 17, and Factor 5 really got their big break on the Amiga. The developers often put a lot of passion into their games, and it really shows. As I previously mentioned, there are so many good games on this thing. Many of the ones I have played are shooters, but there are a lot of other good platformers, strategy games, simulation games, and games of other genres too. However, I might as well just go through some of the gems on this thing. As far as obtaining these games like the Lotus Turbo Challenge series aren't that expensive, but games like Turrican 2 are really rare and hard to come by. Thankfully, if you connect the no-modem serial cable to a PC with Amiga Explorer, you can write ROM images to the disks, so that's a nice way to try out these games, but I always prefer original copies anyway. As one could imagine, there are a lot of arcade ports, but of varying quality. I think the port of R-Type is the best version I have ever played, and Return of the Jedi is always fun, but some others like the port of Super Contra are absolutely horrendous. So in the end, I would say that the Amiga is by far my favorite gaming machine, but if you live in the US, it's best to emulate these games first, and see if you are as crazy about them as I am before getting one. Because getting one over here, and the converters on top of that is a real pain. But was it worth the pain? Oh, absolutely! Ever since I started looking into these games, I have barely touched even the most prolific games, because I have been busy playing my Amiga instead. Overall, the Amiga is a wonderful machine that every computer geek and gamer should at least look into. See you next time.